Well, this morning, I want to think with you about a couple of thoughts about hope. What does hope mean? Now, I don't get a chance to speak very often. I probably have a few more chances that I could even have, but I don't often have these opportunities. And as you know, I like to think about the words that we use. Not simply because I'm a storyteller, but because I just think sometimes we use words all the time and we barely give thought to the words that we use when we use them. So we think about hope all the time. We tell people all the time, well, I hope you have a good day. Well, I hope you're feeling better. I certainly hope she doesn't get the flu. I hope I don't get it. I mean, we use hope pretty casually, almost innocuously at times. We speak of hope religiously. With religious language, we think in terms of the hope to come. We think of our hope, the hope of our salvation. We use the language of hope emphatically, and yet I wonder sometimes if we seriously understand what we're saying. But the emphasis that we place on it, that if in fact it really holds that much meaning for us, or if it's just a nice way to sort of root ourselves in some tradition. So we have this common hope as Christians. Well, what hope is that? I thought about asking questions, and then I decided, well, maybe that wouldn't be good because usually people think of those as being rhetorical. So I'll answer some questions for you, maybe, and then you can look at me and go, it's not at all what I think. But I think for most of us, when we think of hope, we think of a longing. That for many, we think of longing for things to come. When we think of a hope of our salvation, we think of a longing of the kingdom of God coming present or becoming present. Or perhaps some of us think of that afterlife, that kingdom after we leave this earthly veil, as Dante would call it. But think about what that's saying. I mean, if our hope is about what might happen or what we hope will happen, what are we really saying? Well, we're putting it in God's hands. Then what's God asking of us? I mean, the problem for us sometimes, I think, and it's a natural tendency, is to sometimes equate hope with Christmas, with a Christmas kind of attitude. Hope becomes wishing. Or as Frederick Buechner, the writer and theologian, used to say, it becomes wishful thinking. The idea that if something does come to pass, then of course that's what I'm hoping will happen, but that's really no more than just simply wishful thinking. I hope so. And then if we think, well, I hope not, basically we're saying 50-50. We're really gambling with God's presence here. I mean, it's somewhat harsh language, and I'll probably step on a few toes when I say that, but I think that's probably what we get to. When we really sort of get to the heart of what we're saying, when we have this hope, the reality is that it's pretty innocuous. The reality is that it's pretty much a phrase that we try to keep rooted into something, but it's kind of mysterious, and we're not sure we want to go far enough to really understand what that means, and so we just use the phrasing, but in reality, we're just gambling with God's presence. 50-50. I hope so. I hope not. When I was once up in Boston, this really was rung home to me, and it has been in many experiences in my life over the years. I've shared this story before. When I was in Boston, I was looking at the Swedenborgian School of Religion. Now, you have no idea, most of you have no idea who that was or what that was. I won't even go into it too much other than he was a Reformationist in the 1700s and one of these sort of genius philosopher-theologian types from Sweden. But he had a school of religion that was it's a Protestant school, but very small denomination, you can imagine, based in Boston. I was a student at TCU at Bright Divinity, and a good friend of mine was going up there for his PhD, so I said, there were things about Swedenborg that I really found fascinating, and I wanted to explore it, but not seriously as a seminary, just more about who he was. Well, we were at the Burlington exit. There's a Burlington exit or to get on to go further north out of Boston. And so as I was sitting there, the other person was there. He was a rabbi. I mean, he had the thank you. I was thinking skull cap, but yes. Yeah, he was wearing that. And as he looked up at me, being a good rabbi, I suppose, he engaged me in a conversation. And I smiled and I said, hello. And he said, so, and I'm not even going to pretend, okay, well, so what are you here for? It's going to sound Irish if I keep it up, so I won't do that. So he asked me what I was doing there, and I told him I was looking at Swedenborgian School of Religion. Well, he was fascinated. He knew all about the school, had friends that taught there and such. He said, so what was I thinking about? And I said, well, I'm looking at that, and I was thinking about Boston Theological Seminary as well, over at Boston University. I'm just kind of exploring things. And he said, so what do you want to do with that? Well, at the time, I was pursuing pastoral psychology and pastoral counseling, my undergrad degree in psychology. And I said, well, I might be looking at being a counselor. He says, so you're thinking about getting a degree, like a master's or a PhD? And I said, well, I hope so. And he looked at me and he said, well, I hope not. And I said, excuse me? And he said, well, do you know or not? And I said, well, that's what I'm hoping to do. And he says, you're hoping? Well, then I hope not. And he kept pushing this. And I said, I don't really understand. He says, so I tell you a story. And I've told you this one before. He told me this story, this rabbinical tale. I'll give you the nutshell. He said, there was once this prince who was an amazing archer. He was a marksman of an archer. No one could match his skill. He began to describe for me the country where he lived in Eastern Europe. He said, well, this man would travel all about looking for competition and could find no one. One day, this wealthy prince, this marksman of a prince, had heard about a marksman to match none other in a small village far south, about a day's journey from his own city. So he said this marksman then started out to that small town. And as he got to the town, he began inquiring for where is this other amazing marksman. He said, I'm looking for competition. I'm looking for someone to show me up, someone to give me something to help me grow, to learn more from. And they all said, well, you'll find no one better. He lives just beyond the village. He lives on a small farm. You can't miss it. You'll see all the targets. He's amazing. And so the prince, he followed the directions, and he came to this small farm. Well, it was a long hedge along this dirt road, and as he walked along the hedge, he could peer around the side and see all of these huge trees with bullseyes on them. He was amazed. Arrows dead center. As he came around the side of the hedgerow, he looked back, and there he saw a small boy, no more than about 10 years old. Quiver of arrows in his back there, and he was pulling them out and putting them in the bow and pulling them back. He couldn't believe it, seeing all these targets. He looked over at this young boy, and he said, wait a minute. And the boy stopped. He put the arrow back. He said, yes, sir, can I help you? And this prince said, are you telling me you're the one that shot all these bullseyes? And the young boy said, yes, I am. Now, you're not lying to me. No. He said, I'm telling you the truth, sir. I shot every one of these. These bullseyes. He said, yes, sir. He said, that's incredible. He said, I've been studying all of my life. I'm 4 times your age. And here you are, a master. How is this possible? And he says, I don't know. It's easy. The boy said, I put the arrow in the bow, I pull it back, and then I let it fly. Wherever it hits, I draw a bullseye around it. I'm glad you didn't remember that. Some of you did, I'm sure. So I looked at the rabbi and I asked him, and I said, so what's the point of that? And of course he gave me a classic answer. He says, I don't know. He said, so maybe it has something to do with where you find yourself. He said, maybe it has something to do with how you apply yourself wherever you find yourself. He said, maybe it's not about hoping. Maybe it's about seeing where you are and making the most out of that moment and then seeing if that moves you forward. He said, you can also chase bullseyes all around, and you may never hit a one. In fact, he said, and this is where he got a little cryptic, he said, you may be missing all the ones that you've hit and didn't know it yet. Well, honestly, I smiled and I thanked him because I love that kind of stuff, but I had to admit it made no sense to me afterwards because it didn't spell anything out very clearly. I still went to that seminary thinking about whether or not to go there. I still ended up at Bright, and 30 years later, I'm still trying to figure out if this is what I should be doing. But there is something to what he said. This idea that maybe hope isn't about thinking about what might happen. Maybe hope is about what you're doing now. And if that's the case, then maybe we really shouldn't be hoping so much as doing. This passage of Matthew is one of my favorite passages because it's early on before Jesus, in Matthew at least, for Matthew's gospel, before Jesus starts speaking about all the parables. And as he starts talking about the parables of the kingdom, he starts illuminating what he's been illustrating earlier or teaching earlier. So here in one of his teachings, he's talking about anxiety and worrying, about future predictions, about kingdoms to come. and all of these things that that the Jewish people were worried about. And he says, don't worry about any of these things. God takes care of everything. God's taking care of the world. God's taking care of the simplest things. Life is filled with God's presence, essentially. And then he says, but seek the kingdom of God first, and all these things will be added to you. Now that's a tricky phrase, because the question then becomes, what is the kingdom of God? I mean, what is it we're supposed to be seeking? And Jesus had said, in my presence, in several other places, he had said, in my presence the kingdom is made real. It's come in me. What does that mean, then, to seek the kingdom? I think we have great examples in our lifetime. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi. I heard Gandhi's grandson speaking this morning. I don't know if any of you all were listening to NPR this morning, but I was listening as I got ready, and he was being interviewed. And I was amazed at how he spoke about his father, his grandfather, and how after his grandfather had been shot, and all of his efforts, he had made to try to free India from Britain's rule and to bring peace between the various groups, ethnic groups in India, that later, after things had even settled down to some degree, and the country had been partitioned here and there, he was still shot. He was still assassinated. And his grandson had said how bitter and angry he was, how much he wanted to find that person for taking his grandfather out of his life, for taking such a gentle, amazing person out of the world. And he remembered immediately the way his grandfather was. Not just his nonviolent approach, but his attitude about life in general. And then he said something I thought was pretty interesting. Nonviolence we often think of as being a resistance to a conflict, a resistance to engage in a conflict, a halting of ourselves before we engage in what would normally be an escalating issue. Physically, perhaps, or with weapons, perhaps, or with attitudes. But for him, for his grandson, what he said the attitude of nonviolence, the only reason why people like Hitler and why Hussein and why violence is so prominent and prevalent is because our culture is a violent culture. Our culture is not a nonviolent culture. Nonviolence begins with humility. Nonviolence begins with attentiveness. Nonviolence begins with presence to one another, being present to one another. And he said, until that happens, there will always be people who will somehow rise to the surface in the midst of what's already violent and tense and unjust and unequal and isolated from one another, and will rise to the surface. And folks will flock and folks will perish, because the basis of our culture is still a violent culture. What does it mean to live with hope? I want to end with a story, and then I want to share a song, but I think sometimes hope, you can look at a town, you can look at a community, you can look at a family, you can walk into a school setting. I'm looking back at Peter Canning, who's worked with the Institute for Restorative Communities, and he knows what I'm talking about. You can walk into a school setting. You can tell if it's a culture of nonviolence or a culture of violence. You can tell if it's a culture of hope or a culture of alienation. And I don't use the word opposite of hope as hopeless, because I don't think that's the word. I think hopeless is like hope. It's one of those innocuous words that you can throw out there, but it says nothing. The opposite of hope is alienation, inaction, apathy. You can tell that by looking at a community. When I was in Ireland, and I had been traveling for a month looking for I was studying Irish culture. I was looking at my own father's roots. He was born in Ireland. I was looking at some of those connections. It was a 30-day cycling trip that I did on my own. And at the end of the trip, I spent a week in this wonderful town called Glenculmkill. It's on the very northwest corner of Ireland, up against Northern Ireland, near County Derry. It's in County Donegal. It's one of the most remote counties in all of Ireland. If you ever travel to Ireland, it's one of the most beautiful and eerie parts of Ireland you can experience because of how remote it is. But that was what I was looking for, just something to get really connected to people. They still spoke Gaelic. Now, this was 15 years ago, but they still spoke Gaelic in most of the places. They spoke English as well, but they preferred the Gaelic. So I'd gone for a week of studying to learn a little Gaelic as I was there. I'd even learned how to say hello, how are you, and then you're an idiot. That's the only 3 phrases I learned. I don't remember why that one stuck to me, and I didn't mean you. I pointed, but I didn't. But you know, I can tell you how to say that later on if you're just looking to say something, and you don't want to be offensive. But no, I learned how to say a few things and thank you. And it was wonderful because you felt like you were part of something unknown and mysterious because you had moved into another culture and were trying to be present with that culture. So I went to this little town, Glencolmkill. Well, the minute I got in this town, I realized, number one, they were friendly, but number two, there was a sense of despair about them. There was a sense of apathy. I mean, their day was pretty much, it was a little town with a road that went right through it and led to the coast, the Atlantic coast. People would sometimes go there and stay in the one little hotel that was at the end of that road, and then otherwise you'd stay at B&Bs. The little road wound through this little village. At one end of the village was a pub. At the other end of the village was a pub. In the middle of the village on the road was a pub, and then across the street was the Catholic Church and the cemetery. And then there were some shops in between, and that was the town. And you could look at that town and you go, okay, I know what this life is about. I know what this town is about. It's about hard work and farming. It's about crafts and tourism that they can sell. It's about drinking and the stories they can tell when they get together. And it's about confession and shame. And that was pretty much it. So the first night after class, when I gathered at the pub and I sat around, there was some fun. There was drinking. There was sharing. There was like meeting people one after another. And then people didn't talk so much about their own life, but they loved to talk about each other's lives. So they'd start talking about others after a while and talking about, oh, he's had the hardest time, you know, and then, oh, he's seen the hardship he has, and just different things that they would express about each other. Then they would get into patriotism and sing about the evil North. And that seemed to rally them. And then they would drift back and talk about, oh, so-and-so, how Patrick just hasn't found faith recently and hasn't darkened the doors of the church in months and months. And then we'd talk more about patriotism. And it went back and forth. And you were left with this sense of, well, what was there for them to look forward to? So one night I was walking to the pub from my B&B, which is at the other end of town. Now, this is a weird story. And I just preface it by saying it's strange. And don't judge me. But as I was coming, it was about 10:30 at night. It was dark, and this is on the coastal edge, and it's windswept, and it's wet, and it's moist, and it's foggy. And as I was coming up over the hill, these tiny little street lights, which barely illuminate the space beneath them and look eerily like a little spotlight, like a little flashlight shining down from the darkness above, as I was walking in and out of these lights, I sensed a presence. And I looked up in front of me about 50 yards, and I saw someone coming out of the dark shadows towards me down the road. He had a stiff gait to his walk. He was dressed in a dark overcoat. And as he would come in and out of those little lights, I could see he was wearing a wide-brim hat. Now, he was the only other person on the street as I was heading to Mick McCarthy's pub down at the other end, and he was coming towards me. Well, my first thought was, well, maybe he'd had a few drinks. He was a bit stiff and uncomfortable, a little awkward. So as he got closer, I smiled to him, and I tried to catch his attention in a friendly gesture of speaking his own language, and I said, "Gia Dwitch, God be with you." And I expected him to say, "Gia Smardwitch, God and Mary back with you." He didn't say a word. He looked down. I thought, well, okay. I'm a tourist, I'm a Yank, I understand, but I'm not going to be labeled, stereotyped as a selfish, self-centered Yank. So I smiled and I said, "Kaji Maratatu, Jiajich, Kaji Maratatu." So I was asking him, "How are you doing?" "Good, how are you?" Again, he didn't say a word. And I thought, well, maybe he's hard of hearing. So as we got about 10 feet apart, I shouted it out, "Jiadwich!" And he stopped. Now, by that point, it was an uncomfortable stop. Because as he stopped, I realized that we were only 10 feet away, and I didn't know who it was I was just saying hello to, and he looked somewhat scary. And he lifted his face and looked at me, and I kid you not, in that light, in that place, with the darkness and the mist and all of that going on around me, he looked pale and drawn and kind of dead. Now, I was there as part of a storytelling culture, you know. I was trying to learn some of the stories as well, so I thought, well, I met a dead guy in the street of Ireland. That's awesome. And even though I didn't think so much that that was the case, the idea intrigued me. And as I said hello again, he simply grunted at me, turned and walked away and disappeared into the darkness and the fog. I went into McCarthy's. I went up to Liam. Now, Liam O'Malley was the guy who ran the cultural center. Nice guy, but kind of firm. And I saddled up next to him, and I said, Liam, and he had a little pint there he was drinking. I said, Liam, I saw something. And he looked at me kind of funny. And I said, I saw something. And then he pushed the pint aside, and he said, what do you mean you saw something? And I said, okay, this is strange, but I think I saw a dead guy walking in your streets. I was thinking he was going to laugh and just roll back and make a big joke of it. Instead, he pushed it further away, leaned into me in all seriousness and said, describe him. So I described him. He said, doesn't sound anyone that we like someone we would know. And I said, so what do you think? He says, well, you have me worried. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, we know the dead people that walk in our streets. He said, this doesn't sound like one of them. I thought he was pulling my leg, but then he turns over to the next guy next to him and he says, describe for me big John Mackenzie. What's that fella look like now? And he described this other guy, you know, he's big and he's tall and he's kind of drawn. And then I said, he was wearing a big overcoat, and I described him in detail, and they all said, no, that doesn't sound like Big John at all. I don't know. And then they were all worried, and before you know it, the conversation of that night was the dead guy that Tom McDermott saw walking in the streets of Glencolmkill. You would have thought it was a joke. 2 days later, there's a knock on my door at the bed and breakfast where I'm staying with my Japanese roommate. And he says, as I opened the door, they said, we're here to find the dead guy. And there were 20 people outside the door gathered. For the next 3 days, all of the community was centered around looking for the dead guy that I saw in the streets. And I thought it was a big joke. And it turns out that it was. But it wasn't so much a joke on me. It was more a way for them to ease a stress that I did not know about. Because on the last day, we never found the guy, but it had everybody upset and curious and buzzing about it. I even had people walking up to me in the middle of the week, in the middle of the day, saying, you're that Tom McDermott fella. You're from the States, the Yank from the States. And I said, yeah. They said, you're the one that saw the dead guy in the streets the other day, aren't you? And I had people addressing me as the guy that saw the dead guy. On the last day before I left, that night I was sitting down with our hostess, the Banatee, at the place where we're staying, the bed and breakfast, and I was there with Yutaka Ozawa, who was my Japanese roommate from Japan. And we were sitting there at the table, and as I talked about this, I noticed that my hostess seemed pretty distressed and wouldn't say a word. I even had asked why she wasn't involved in all of the fun. And we were having so much fun, it became sort of like a party, and she wouldn't say a word. And at the end of our meal, she let it out. It was her brother-in-law. The fellow was not, in fact, a dead guy. Not that you were worried. The fellow was, in fact, someone who the community had shunned and had isolated. Because her brother-in-law, whose name was in fact Big John Mackenzie, her brother-in-law had married a Protestant, had a child out of wedlock. There's only one Catholic church in that town and no Protestant church for a couple of towns. And it was such a scandal that the poor young woman left. And they said, we don't have any idea where she is and we don't really want to know. And I looked at her and I said, this is your brother-in-law. And she says, it's a sad thing. We shouldn't talk about it. And I said, well, it's not my business to pry, but I said, it seems painful to you. She says, oh, it's painful. And she shared a bit more about just how shameful it was to her and to her family And I asked her the question, I said, are you happy with this? And she looked at me indignant, and of course she wasn't happy with it. And I said, then why do you allow it to continue? And she said, because it's wrong. And I asked her a question that I've often asked many people in conflicted relationships, whether it's with family or partners or with anyone or school. And I think maybe it's something that perhaps Gandhi would have asked, perhaps Martin Luther King. What is it that you would ideally want? What is it you would ideally hope for? And with some tears in her eyes, she said, I wish we were back together. I wish we could talk. And I said, then if that's what you're wishing for, if that's your hope, then perhaps that's the more important thing than the rights and the wrongs. Maybe it's what your heart is saying. I want to finish with a song that a man by the name of Don Henry wrote. It's a beautiful song, but I think it illustrates the complexity of Martin Luther King Jr. and the complexity of the civil rights movement, but also the complexity of how to deal with conflicts. It's amazing how risky it is sometimes to risk that wall, to risk that barrier of our own teachings, our own beliefs that we've been inculcated with, our own cultural realities around us, how hard it is to break through that. But in reality, what we truly hope for is such a simple thing. That in reality, all of us, if we really boiled it down, we really do hope for the kingdom. We really do hope for it now. We really do want to be a part of it now. We just forget sometimes because as creatures of habit, we fail to risk living into that hope. Just a little song called Beautiful Fool. Martin Luther, who did you think that you were? Appointed by some higher up, merely mortal, your plans were unaffordable. No one wants to pay for love. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. Walter Cronkite preempted Disney one night, and all us kids were so upset. We thought that you were a trouble instigator, marching through our TV set. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. To fight a fight without a fist, all human instinct puzzles this. How dare you threaten our existence? Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ. History repeats itself so nice. Consistently we are resistant to love. I saw you on the black and white with blacks and whites applauding you. I saw you on another night, and there was not a sign of life in you. Oh, you beautiful fool, swimming upstream and kicking up waves. Dreams weren't meant to come true. That's why they call them dreams. Oh, you beautiful fool. Oh, you beautiful fool. Amen.